The top-down federal regulation that we're seeing in Europe with the EU taxonomy now mandating disclosure with TCFD, as well as the potential SEC climate rule, will really drive a lot of consolidation in the industry.
Joining me today is Alaine Coffey, Senior Associate Equity Research with Green Street. Alaine, here at REITworks, you were on a panel that was looking at the future of ESG investing in real estate. One of the biggest challenges has been the inconsistencies in ESG taxonomy, reporting, and standards. How do you think this will continue to evolve?
So I think from both industry participants and investors, there's a really strong demand for consolidation. It's not easy for companies to not, sift through all the different reporting frameworks and what they need to do, and it's hard for investors to do the same thing and see, they really want the end data, and the comparability across all these different frameworks is incredibly difficult. A recent MIT study, I think, found the correlation amongst ESG scores is about 60%, whereas traditional credit ratings have a correlation of closer to 99%. And so there's really a lack of consensus around what ESG means. The top-down federal regulation that we're seeing in Europe with the EU taxonomy now mandating disclosure with TCFD, as well as the potential SEC climate rule, will really drive a lot of consolidation in the industry. It will increase the level of rigor for reporting, which will in some ways in the near term decrease a lot of the voluntary reporting. A lot of your voluntary reporting that we have now is optional, it's unaudited, and that's, now that you're held to a higher legal standard and there's an emphasis on building out the data infrastructure for the new legal platform, it's very likely that we'll see a near-term decrease in some of this voluntary reporting, but ultimately you'll have a more standardized reporting framework via the government top-down mandate. And I think that will be helpful for both investors and industry participants to provide consolidation in the space and really create a more appropriate standard that everyone can use that's has a level of apples to apples robustness. Because right now, if you compare two companies, corporate level emissions, they're not really equivalent data points by any means.
And of course, here at REITworks, there's been a lot of conversation regarding the SEC's proposed rules around climate disclosures. How does Green Street evaluate REITs in terms of specific emissions objectives and reports?
When it comes to looking at the corporate level emissions, there's an issue of comparability. There's so much data nuance across sectors or even within the same geography. One thing I like to highlight is the importance of the underlying electric grid. So if you have two buildings, identical energy usage, identical buildings on different grids, a building on a hydro-powered grid in Seattle will have lower emissions than your coal-powered grid in West Virginia. And so to compare two corporate emissions without an appreciation for the grid, or similarly to look at net zero goals for companies and not ask how are they getting to net zero, it doesn't really create the full picture of what the E risk is. And at Green Street, we think about that as one bucket, your physical climate risk. What is the risk that your building will be unduly suffer from flooding, sea level rise? And then there's the second bucket of transition risk. Local regulations are increasing in both the US and Europe. In the UK now, there are minimum energy standards, and if you fail to meet them, you literally cannot lease your building, which is destructive of a real estate owner. And in the US, in your top coastal cities like New York City, emissions fines are expected to cost office landlords 200 bips of NOI. And across different sectors, this can be as high as 600 bips in data centers. So these regulations are going to become quite costly, and we really want to see companies that are managing this risk and paying attention to local regulations and investing in the energy retrofitting needed to get these buildings to adapt and comply with these regulations. It's not just enough to be net zero on a corporate level, it's how you get to net zero, and that these companies are actively managing their risk and seeing how their emissions compare to peers and really being ahead of the curve to understand this data, because the infrastructure is incredibly extensive to build out and in some sectors requires extensive of adding clauses into leases to gain legal access to the data that they do not have currently.
Lastly, when Green Street looks at companies and investments, what are some of the best practices that you seek regarding human capital and DEI?
So again, I think similar to your E, your human capital and DEI policies are both driven by regulation and investor demand. You now have the NASDAQ board diversity rule, which mandates at least one diverse and one female board member, or an explanation if not. Similarly, in a city like Boston, we've seen that any development in the city has to mandate or is mandated to now disclose the diversity, particularly the women and diverse owned businesses in their supply chain. And if you're on public land for a project development in Boston, this is actually scored and used as who gets chosen for the development. So if you are a company in the REIT space, you need to be collecting and actively managing your diversity data, and this is data that both tenants, investors, and municipalities now want from you and expect you to have as a risk and a policy that you're managing. So you really need to be on top of this in order to, be a respected player in the real estate world.